The morning sun rose slowly over Arlington National Cemetery, casting a golden light across the rows of white headstones that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was calm, the kind of silence that made people whisper even without being told. Tourists moved quietly along the paths, many holding cameras, others just standing still, feeling the weight of history around them. Among them stood a soldier, tall and still, his uniform perfect, every line sharp, every movement measured. His name was Sergeant Michael Ward, one of the few chosen to guard the tomb of the unknown soldier. Michael had been part of the old guard for many years. It was not just a duty for him, it was a sacred promise. Every day, he marched 21 steps, turned, paused for 21 seconds, and then walked back, repeating it endlessly. He did this in heat, rain, and snow, never once breaking his rhythm. To him, every step was a way of saying thank you to those who had fallen and never been named. He had buried friends. He had seen war. Now his mission was silence and honor. That morning, something different happened. A group of tourists had gathered a little too close to the white rope that separated the tomb plaza from the public area. They were talking louder than usual, laughing, unaware of how their voices echoed across the marble. Michael didn't react. Tomb guards never spoke unless they had to. Their silence was part of their discipline, a wall of respect between the living and the dead. One of the tourists, a woman visiting from another state, noticed the rifle resting on Michael's shoulder. She didn't know it was ceremonial, meant to symbolize vigilance. Her heart jumped, and without asking anyone, she pulled out her phone and called the local police. "There's a man with a gun standing still at the cemetery," she said nervously. "He's not moving. I think something's wrong." Within minutes, a squad car pulled into the cemetery gates. The officers inside had no idea what they were walking into. All they had was the report of an armed man in uniform, standing near a crowd. They didn't know that this was one of the most sacred duties in the military. They didn't know that silence and stillness were part of the ritual. Michael saw the car arrive out of the corner of his eye, but he didn't turn. He couldn't. Duty came before curiosity. The officers stepped out and began walking toward him. One of them raised his voice. "Sir, put the weapon down." The sound broke the still air like thunder. Tourists turned. Some gasped, others began recording. Michael didn't flinch. His eyes stayed forward. His orders were clear. Nothing, not even a storm, could make him abandon his post unless relieved by another guard. "Sir, this is your last warning." The officer shouted again, moving closer. Michael said nothing. To the officers, it looked like defiance. To those who understood, it was respect. Another officer approached from behind, slowly, hand near his holster. He whispered to his partner, "He's not responding. We have to secure him." Before the nearby cemetery staff could explain, the officers acted. One of them grabbed Michael's arm and pulled it back. The crowd gasped as the sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the air. It was the first time in his entire career that Michael's hands had been restrained. His gloves brushed against the cold steel. His posture didn't break. He didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't fight back. The calmness in his eyes made it even more unsettling for everyone watching. People began murmuring, whispering to each other. "Why are they arresting him?" Someone said, "He's guarding the tomb." Another voice replied. A little boy tugged on his father's jacket and asked softly, "Dad, why are they doing that to the soldier?" His father didn't answer. He just lowered his head, speechless. The officers tried to guide Michael toward their car, but his boots were heavy on the ground. He turned only when ordered, each movement slow and deliberate, as if still part of his silent march. A security guard from the visitor center came running, waving his arms. "Stop! You don't understand," he shouted. "He's not a threat, he's a tomb guard." The police paused, confusion on their faces. One officer frowned. "A what?" "The tomb of the unknown soldier," the guard said breathlessly. "That man has been serving here for years. He's guarding the tomb. That rifle isn't for harm, it's part of the honor code." For a moment, silence returned. The officers looked at Michael again, at the way he stood, unmoving, eyes steady. Something about his calmness, the sharp lines of his uniform, the glint of metals on his chest. made them realize this wasn't a regular arrest, but it was too late. The crowd had already filmed everything. Tourists were angry now, speaking up, calling it disrespect. Let him go. Someone shouted. Then a black SUV appeared from the distance, moving fast but controlled. It stopped sharply near the plaza. Out stepped a tall man in a decorated uniform, Colonel James Harris. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with authority. He was in charge of ceremonial operations for the old guard. The moment he saw Michael with handcuffs around his wrists, his jaw clenched tight. He walked straight toward the officers. No one dared speak. The air around him felt heavy, like a storm rolling in. "What's the meaning of this?" he asked quietly. One of the officers tried to explain. "Sir, we received a call about an armed—" The colonel raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Armed?" he said. "You think the United States Army posts armed criminals to guard the most sacred monument in this country?" The officer hesitated. The colonel took a slow breath, his voice still calm but sharp as steel. "Do you even know who this man is?" "No, sir," the officer answered softly. The colonel stepped closer, his boots clicking against the marble. "This man is a tomb guard of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment. He stands here day and night so you can walk here in peace. He guards the unknown soldiers, the ones who never came home. And you just put handcuffs on him?" The officers' faces paled. One of them reached for the key but froze when the colonel's voice dropped even lower. "Remove those cuffs now," he said. The officer fumbled with the lock, quickly freeing Michael's wrists. The handcuffs fell to the ground with a faint metallic sound. Michael didn't move at first. He simply adjusted his gloves, smoothed his jacket, and returned to his post as if nothing had happened. That calm dignity struck everyone silent. The colonel looked around at the crowd, his expression firm but composed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, "you are standing on sacred ground. This man's silence is his service. His rifle is not a weapon of threat, it is a symbol of duty. He has earned more respect than any of us could ever repay." The people began to nod. Some placed their hands over their hearts. Others lowered their cameras. Even the children understood that something serious had just taken place. The colonel turned back to Michael and spoke quietly. "Are you all right, Sergeant?" Michael nodded slightly. "Yes, sir. Permission to continue my duty?" "Granted," the colonel said. Michael returned to his mark, turned, and began his 21 steps again. The rhythm of his boots echoed softly across the marble. Every eye followed him, watching how he carried himself with the same calm as before. The colonel then faced the officers again. "You will stay here," he said. "You will wait until I am done. We're going to have a talk about respect, about what this place means." The officers stood stiff, embarrassed and silent. They didn't argue. They couldn't. They had learned something powerful in those few minutes, something no classroom or rule book could teach. When the colonel finally turned back toward his car, he looked once more at Michael. The soldier's movements hadn't changed. He was back in perfect form, guarding the tomb as if the handcuffs had never existed. But those who saw it knew that something deep had just unfolded, an act of grace, discipline, and unshakable pride. By afternoon, people began sharing what they had seen online. Short videos appeared with titles like "Police Arrest Tomb Guard by Mistake" and "Colonel Steps in at Arlington." Within hours, thousands of viewers watched the calm strength of the soldier and the quiet power of the colonel's words. For Michael, the day ended as it always did. He finished his shift, handed over his weapon to the next guard, and walked off silently toward the barracks. He didn't check his phone or look at the news. He didn't need to. For him, honor didn't depend on what people saw or said. It lived in the small, quiet moments when he kept his oath, even when others didn't understand it. As he cleaned his rifle and folded his gloves, a fellow soldier asked softly, "You okay, Ward?" Michael smiled faintly. "Duty never stops," he said. "That's what they taught me. That's what I'll teach the next one." Outside, the sun was setting behind the cemetery, painting the sky in gold and red. The tomb plaza was quiet again, the air still and respectful. Tourists who had seen what happened earlier were now telling others to lower their voices, to walk slower, to show respect. The lesson had spread without words, and somewhere nearby, the colonel stood by his car for a long moment before leaving. He looked back at the white stones, at the soldier still standing guard, and thought to himself that sometimes true strength wasn't loud or forceful. Sometimes it was silent, steady, and unbreakable, like the man who kept walking 21 steps at a time, even after being handcuffed for doing his duty. The next morning came quietly. A thin mist covered the marble paths of Arlington National Cemetery. The air was cool and heavy with silence. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood as it always had, unchanging and eternal. And there, in his polished uniform, stood Sergeant Michael Ward once again. Nothing about him seemed different, though the world outside was now watching him more closely than ever before. Overnight, the videos of the arrest had spread everywhere. Millions of people had seen the scene of a tomb guard being handcuffed, then freed by a colonel's firm words. Some had cried watching it. Others felt ashamed that something like that could happen. Messages poured in from veterans, families of fallen soldiers, and people from all over the country. Everyone wanted to know who the silent soldier was who never lost his composure, even in the face of humiliation. But Michael wasn't thinking about any of that. His thoughts were simple, quiet, and steady. He had a job to do. When he took his first 21 steps that morning, each one felt like a reminder that duty was stronger than misunderstanding. That honor didn't need to shout to be heard. Colonel James Harris arrived a little later, walking across the plaza with a few officers beside him. His face was calm but serious. He had spent the night thinking about what had happened. It wasn't anger he felt, it was responsibility. Something had to be taught, not through punishment, but through understanding. Waiting for him at the visitor center were the same police officers from the day before. They looked tired, quiet, and uneasy. None of them were in uniform now. They had come on their own time. When the colonel arrived, they all stood. "Thank you for coming," the colonel said in a level voice. "Today, you'll learn what this place means. Not from a book, not from a video, but by standing here, feeling what it stands for." The officers nodded. They didn't argue. They followed the colonel through the gates toward the tomb plaza. As they approached, the sound of Michael's steady boots echoed across the stone. Step, pause, turn. Every movement was precise. "Watch him," the colonel said softly. "He's been standing here since before sunrise. Rain, wind, or snow, it doesn't matter. Not one word, not one mistake. He does this for the nameless men and women buried here. That rifle isn't for show. It represents readiness, protection, respect." The officers listened quietly. The oldest among them lowered his eyes, shame written across his face. "We thought he was dangerous," he said. The colonel shook his head. "No, he's devoted. There's a difference." For the next several hours, the officers stayed on the grounds. They were shown how the guards trained, how every button on the uniform was measured, how even the polish on their shoes had to be perfect. They learned that each guard memorized the names of the battles, the history of the regiment, and the meaning behind every gesture. At noon, the colonel gathered them again near the steps. "Yesterday you acted fast. That's what police do. You respond to threats. But sometimes, gentlemen, not everything that looks dangerous is wrong. Sometimes strength wears silence." The youngest officer, barely 30, spoke softly. "Sir, we didn't mean disrespect. We just didn't know." The colonel nodded. "And that's why you're here to know." He pointed toward Michael, who was now mid-rotation, his rifle glinting in the sunlight. "Look at him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't resist. He didn't even step back. He held his position because his promise mattered more than his pride. That's what honor looks like." One of the officers swallowed hard. "We owe him an apology. You will give it to him," the colonel said simply. When Michael's relief arrived, the ceremony was carried out in perfect silence. Two guards faced each other, their movements synchronized like clockwork. The watching officers stood completely still, understanding the depth of what they were witnessing. When it ended, Michael turned to face the colonel and saluted. "Sir," the colonel returned the salute. "Sergeant, you know why these men are here?" Michael nodded. "Yes, sir." The colonel looked at the officers. "Gentlemen," the police sergeant stepped forward, removing his cap. "Sir, we're sorry. We didn't understand what this post meant. We saw a rifle and acted. We should have asked. We should have known better." Michael listened quietly, his expression calm. After a moment, he said, "You did what you thought was right. That's what service is, acting when others hesitate. Just sometimes the hardest thing to do is nothing." His words carried more weight than any speech could. Even the wind seemed to pause. "We'll never forget this," one officer said quietly. "Good," Michael replied softly. "Neither will I." The colonel placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "You handled yourself like a true soldier," he said. "There's nothing stronger than quiet dignity." Michael gave a small nod. "Just doing my duty, sir." The colonel turned back to the group. "Let this day remind all of us that honor can't be mistaken for arrogance. And silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any order." Later that day, the colonel invited the officers to visit the Tombs Museum room, where the uniforms, medals, and history of the old guard were displayed. They saw photographs of guards standing knee-deep in snow, their faces covered in ice, still holding their rifles straight. They saw records of soldiers who had stood through hurricanes, earthquakes, and even during national crises without missing a single step. They do this 24 hours a day. The colonel said, "Even during storms, one guard marches. When the country sleeps, he's awake. When the world forgets, he remembers." By the time the officers left, their faces were different. The pride they'd worn yesterday had softened into deep respect. One of them stopped near the exit, turned, and looked again at the tomb plaza. "It's strange," he whispered to his partner. "Yesterday I thought that man was dangerous. Today, I realize he's the safest thing here." The partner nodded. "Yeah, he's guarding what's left of all of us." The colonel overheard them, but said nothing. He just smiled slightly and walked away. That evening, Michael finally returned to his quarters. His back ached, but his heart was steady. He sat down on the edge of his bunk and took off his gloves. The leather was worn from countless hours of holding the rifle, yet it still felt right in his hands. One of the younger guards entered. "Saw the news, Sergeant," he said. "You're all over the internet." Michael gave a small shrug. "Doesn't matter. People are calling you a hero." Michael looked up slowly. "Heroes are buried out there," he said. "I just watch over them." The young guard nodded quietly, understanding more in that single sentence than any training could teach. Outside, reporters had gathered beyond the gates, but the army made no official statement. The colonel believed the moment spoke for itself. Still, a formal apology was delivered from the police department, signed by their chief. It was respectful, honest, and written with care. It was read aloud at the next guard change, not for attention, but as a sign that understanding had replaced confusion. Over the next few days, people from all over began visiting the tomb in greater numbers. Families brought flowers. Veterans saluted longer than usual. Even children stood a little straighter. The story had reminded everyone that the world still had quiet heroes, men and women, who stood in silence so others could speak freely. One morning, a letter arrived for Michael. It was handwritten by an elderly widow whose husband had died in World War I and had never been found. Her words were simple. "Thank you for standing for him when he couldn't stand for himself." Michael kept that letter folded neatly inside his uniform pocket from that day on. A week later, Colonel Harris met Michael again during inspection. "The world has learned your name, Sergeant," he said. "But I know you didn't do this for fame." "No, sir," Michael replied. "I did it for them." He glanced toward the tomb. The colonel followed his gaze, feeling a quiet pride rise in his chest. "You've reminded everyone what service truly means," he said. "Sometimes the lesson comes from silence, and sometimes from standing your ground." "It wasn't courage, sir," Michael said humbly. "It was habit." The colonel smiled. "Habit like that is what keeps the world together." That evening, when Michael took his place for the night shift, the cemetery was almost empty. The sky was dark, and a few stars shone above. The air was cool and clean. As he began his steps, his mind drifted briefly to the events of the past days, the misunderstanding, the colonel's words, the officer's apology, in the quiet unity that followed. He felt no anger, no pride, just peace. Each echo of his boots seemed to carry meaning now. Each pause was heavier, deeper. He realized something: the lesson wasn't only for the officers. It was for everyone watching, including himself. Even when the world doesn't understand you, you keep walking. Even when others doubt your purpose, you stay steady. Near midnight, the colonel returned one last time. He stood in the shadows, watching Michael march. After a while, he spoke quietly. "Sergeant, the world is loud, but this silence, it teaches more than words ever could." Michael didn't break his rhythm, but he answered softly between steps. "Yes, sir." Silence has its own voice. The colonel nodded, then left without another word. And so the days went on. The story slowly faded from headlines, but not from hearts. Those who had witnessed it never forgot. The officers often returned to pay their respects. The tourists who had made the mistaken call wrote a public apology and donated to a veterans fund. The world moved on, but something small and meaningful remained changed.